Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am Tim Huxley, Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies Asia in Singapore, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the fifth in this year's series of IISS Fullerton Lectures at the Fullerton Hotel in the heart of this city-state's financial district. The IISS Fullerton Lecture Series comprises 8 lectures a year on questions of foreign policy, defense and national security strategy, transnational security challenges, conflict resolution, international reconciliation, domestic political change, and, as in the case of today's lecture, what we in the IISS refer to as geoeconomics. So far this year, we have heard lectures in the series from the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, British Foreign Secretary William Hague, former US Ambassador to Afghanistan and ISAF Commander General Carl Eikenberry, and most recently, former World Bank Group CEO Robert Zoellick. As part of the continuing series of IISS Fullerton Lectures, I'm delighted today that Klaus Regling, CEO of the European Financial Stability Facility, will address us on the crucially important topic of the euro and the future of Europe. Few topics are more crucial from the viewpoint of those concerned with the future of the international economy, whether they are in government or the private sector. The lecture that you will hear shortly could not be more timely in view of continuing anxieties globally, including in Asia, about the state of Europe's economy and the future of Europe. And no one could speak more authoritatively, I think, on this topic than Mr. Regling. I'm extremely pleased that my IISS colleague, Dr. Sanjaya Baru, who leads the Institute's geoeconomics program from his base in New Delhi, is with us today. And I'll now ask Sanjaya to introduce Klaus Regling more fully. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Mr. Regling, ladies and gentlemen, my two Singapore gurus, Tommy Koh and Kishore Mahbubani, used to always tell me that one should not have more than 3 points to make when one speaks. So I will restrict myself to 3 points. 1, I am delighted to be back in Singapore. And 2, I am particularly delighted to be back with someone I spent a year in Singapore, which is Mr. Regling. Klaus and I were colleagues with Kishore at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in those months when Lehman collapsed and the transatlantic financial crisis stared us in our face. I remember Klaus giving several important lectures at the Lee Kuan Yew School as he analyzed the events of 2008, 2009, and subsequently he went back to Europe to actually take charge. He's in the hot seat. Before introducing Klaus to you, let me introduce the Geoeconomics and Strategy program, because the audience in Singapore normally associates IISS with the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is the annual major event of the IISS in this part of the world. And the Shangri-La Dialogue is a gathering of defense ministers and strategists and geopolitical analysts. But one of the consequences of the global financial crisis of 2008-2009 is that many strategists and geopolitical analysts began to understand the significance of global economic changes, not just the underlying shifts that Kishore Mahbubani has written so prolifically about, the shift of the engines of growth from the west to the east, but more contemporaneously, the impact of the global crisis on geopolitics in the West, on geopolitics in the East, the crisis in Europe, the rise of China, and so on and so forth. So the IISS set up the Geoeconomics and Strategy program as a means of bringing economists and geopolitical analysts together to try and understand how global economic shifts and global economic changes were impacting on geopolitics and global political relations. The geoeconomics program has already had a couple of major conferences, one on the impact of changing market for energy on geopolitics in the Middle East, second conference on the relationship between economic risk and political risk as a consequence of the crisis. And we now are planning a third conference on the shift from a world in which one currency dominated economic transactions, namely the US dollar, to a world in which Mr. Regling will refer to as a multipolar world, multipolar monetary system in which you have the dollar, the euro, the renminbi, the real, the rupee, the ruble, and so many other currencies beginning to play an increasingly active role. So given the widening scope of the IISS, we are delighted to host this morning Klaus Regling. I guess most of you have his CV, so I'll just take a minute to summarize the 2 or 3 key aspects of his biodata. One, that he has both a private sector and a government background. He's worked with Moore Capital Strategy, the German Bankers Union, and other private sector institutions. As I mentioned, he was a fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, but before he went back to Europe to take over as the CEO of the European Financial Stability Facilities, he had spent a decade in the Ministry of Finance in Germany, where he prepared the strategy paper for economic and monetary union in Europe. And he spent a decade with the International Monetary Fund, with whom he now has occasions to agree and disagree, and we'll hear more about it. Klaus.
Thank you, Sanjaya. Thank you, Tim, for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be back in Singapore. I always like to come here, and it's good to see so many old friends in the audience. And I'm happy to offer you my thoughts on the situation in Europe, the euro, and the future of European integration. Many believe that Europe is in a big mess. The sovereign debt crisis has lasted 3 years, and there seems to be no end in sight. Every day I see headlines and market comments about the imminent breakup of the euro area, Greece leaving, rating downgrades, increases in spreads, too small firewalls in Europe, too little action too late by political leaders. I'm sure such comments are familiar to all of you. Has then the creation of Economic and Monetary Union, EMU, been a mistake, a failure? No, it has not. The euro is a currency that is the outcome of a long history of monetary and economic cooperation and integration in Europe, dating back to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. Even during the 70s, after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, European countries tried to limit changes in the exchange rates of their different currencies in order to protect intra-European trade. In 1979, the European exchange rate mechanism was created. European monetary cooperation has survived many crises, and the Maastricht Treaty, ratified in 1992, paved the way for the creation of the euro. The eventual launch of EMU in 1999 was only possible because of this long history of increasing integration and convergence. The euro is the result of a process that lasted 4 decades, and its importance for Europe has to be assessed in this long-term perspective. It would also be a mistake to see the euro narrowly, exclusively as a project of economics. The euro is one of the defining pillars of today's European Union, of a union which is also developing a common foreign and defense policy, which fights cross-border crime and terrorism, which is based on shared values, democracy, and legal certainty. In addition, of course, to open borders and the single market. This is a context against which EMU must be seen. However, we are in a crisis in Europe, and there are reasons for the crisis. Economic policies did not take sufficiently into account the constraints of being a member of EMU and sharing one currency. Easy access to borrowing allowed governments to postpone needed reforms. Too low risk premia and too little differentiation during the boom years revealed markets' failures to price risks properly and led to too much leveraging and debt overhang. The global financial crisis made all this much worse. What has been the European response at the national and the union level to get our house in order again? What is the vision of the future Europe, and how can we get there? I will use my remarks today to challenge mainstream media and market wisdoms by demonstrating to you that the European adjustment strategy is delivering results. Despite the lack of confidence of market participants and the skepticism of the broad public, member states of the euro area and the European Union have made significant progress at the national level towards reducing macroeconomic imbalances. In addition, economic surveillance has been strengthened, more efficient financial market supervision is being put in place, and several institutional gaps are being closed. The reforms implemented at the national level, in conjunction with the strengthening of economic governance and growth-enhancing measures taken at the EU level, have started to deliver results. Let me offer some facts to convince you. First, the euro area as a whole will have a fiscal deficit of about 3% of GDP this year, down from more than 6% in 2009-2010. And this is less than half of the deficits of the US and Japan. All the countries in the periphery have delivered sizable fiscal adjustment, and deficits are on an improving trend in all program countries. Beyond that, all EU member states have budgetary consolidation paths in place with a clear objective to reach a balanced budget during the next few years. In addition, all southern European countries are implementing far-reaching reforms of their labor markets and pension systems, and all these countries have seen sizable cuts in nominal wages, salaries, and pensions. Second, with significant adjustment at the national level, macroeconomic imbalances within the euro area are clearly declining. Europe has suffered from substantial internal imbalances. Large current account deficits and large divergences in competitiveness were symptoms of past excesses. However, current account deficits and competitiveness of the Eurozone's peripheral economies have been improving significantly during the last 3 years. Ireland shows now a current account surplus after sizable deficits in earlier years. Spain is getting very close to a current account balance after deficits of 10% of GDP in 2007 and 2008. Also, Greece and Portugal have reduced their current account deficits by 2/3. And this is due to export growth in all southern European countries rather than import compression. As important, the current account surplus of Germany is steadily declining. Likewise, nominal unit labor costs have declined significantly in the periphery and are increasing in Germany, underpinning the story of rebalancing. The competitiveness gap between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, that amounted to nearly 50% in 2007-2008, has been cut in half. Third, the repair of the European banking system is advancing, and banks' capitalization is improving. All major European banks that had a capital shortfall have raised their capitalization to comply with stricter rules and to meet the 9% Tier 1 capital requirements, and this happened by the middle of this year. 3/4 of this additional capital requirement came from capital increases, and only 1/4 through the reduction in assets, thus avoiding excessive deleveraging. Spain is due to receive up to 100 billion euro to recapitalize its banking sector, which has suffered from the bursting of the Spanish property bubble. Bank recapitalization has also been a major element in the Irish, Greek, and Portuguese support programs. As a result, European banks will be on a much sounder footing and able to finance the real economy again. Fourth, inflation risks in the euro area are well contained, with headline inflation on average just slightly above 2%. The risk of deflation, which is often emphasized by Anglo-Saxon analysts, but also the IMF in its latest Article 4 review, is minimal in my view. The adjustment path I described is needed to undo past excesses, but it does mean, unfortunately, that Europe is slow to return to growth. Undoing excesses of the past implies contraction in output in the short term. This path to a new equilibrium with lower real income is unavoidable. Real incomes need to shrink to regain competitiveness, and while this happens, domestic demand and GDP growth are low or negative. While painful, it is necessary to build a solid foundation for sustainable growth in the future. I disagree with those who argue that a devaluation would be an easier way out to improve competitiveness. It is structural reforms which make countries competitive in a sustainable way. As devaluations are not possible in a monetary union anyway, cuts in nominal income are an inevitable part of the adjustment process. I know this view is against Anglo-Saxon textbooks, but those textbooks may have to be rewritten as European countries demonstrate that cuts in nominal income can improve competitiveness quickly. If the adjustment reforms are duly implemented, Europe will be back on its long-term growth potential of the order of 1 to 2%. For many, this growth rate may seem like underperformance, but one has to be realistic. At Europe's level of GDP per capita, which is close to the global technological frontier, and given our negative demographic trends, 1 to 2% real growth is what the euro area can sustainably achieve over the next decade. And you must remember that on a per capita basis, growth in Europe and the United States has been identical during the last 20 years. Of course, it is true that weaker demand from Europe has an impact on many exporting countries, including in this region, and on world trade. Europe still represents 20% of the global economy, and the EU is the largest trading partner for most countries around the world. However, the flip side of the coin is that the bubble years until 2007 inflated global demand above sustainable trends. Ladies and gentlemen, I tried to explain that the response to the crisis at the national level has been significant and results are increasingly visible, even though widely ignored. It is a combination of these national reforms and strengthened economic governance at European level that is a key to overcoming the sovereign debt crisis. And this is what is happening. European governments have done a great deal to address the problems that accumulated during the first decade of EMU and which became so visible during the global crisis. They have identified the main weaknesses at national and European level, and they are tackling them in a way that will profoundly change governance and economic policy making in the euro area. First, we have in Europe agreed on the so-called fiscal compact. This new treaty, which is in the final stage of ratification by all euro area member states and 8 other EU countries, provides for much tighter coordination of fiscal and economic policies. It sets out binding budgetary rules, including automatic sanctions, which member states will enshrine in their national legislation. The fiscal compact strengthens the Stability and Growth Pact and enhances deeper fiscal coordination. Member states are required to make significant progress towards balanced budgetary positions. Expenditure benchmarks will now be used alongside the structural budget balance to assess adjustments towards the balanced budget objective. A controlled reduction of the debt ratio to 60% of GDP is required. Both the reduction in deficits and the reduction of total debt are subject to a new sanctions procedure. Resolutions proposed by the European Commission can be adopted even against a majority of euro area countries. This reduces the possibility of political interference significantly. Second, the European semester was introduced last year, which represents another major achievement. In the first half of every year, member states' budgetary and structural policy intentions are reviewed by the Commission and by partner countries. It will enable consistent policy guidance early enough so that member states can take this into account when they adopt budgets in their national parliaments for the following year. Thus, for the first time, spillover effects to other member states will be taken into account before national budgets are adopted by parliaments. Third, a new macroeconomic imbalances procedure has been adopted with the aim to detect and avoid excessive macroeconomic imbalances. Where excessive imbalances exist, repeated failures to follow recommendations by the European partners will result in sanctions. This closes another structural gap in the design of EMU. In the past, imbalances could become excessive as there was no designated procedure to address them at the European level. And fourth, Europe has created strong firewalls. The establishment of a robust euro area crisis management framework has filled another gap in the original design of EMU. Financial crisis management mechanisms, the current EFSF and the future ESM, form the centerpiece of this framework. Financing from the EFSF and soon the ESM buys time for euro area member states to do their homework, as the IMF does globally. Let me put the financial side of the European response in perspective. By providing financial assistance to troubled euro area members and committing to lend money in support of the global economy through the IMF, Europe has mobilized about $1.5 trillion, 1.5 trillion, of which 2/3 are still available for disbursement. Europe, to show some details, Europe has committed 197 billion euro to the 2 Greek assistance packages, 45 billion euro to Ireland and 52 billion euro to Portugal. And it has agreed to lend up to 100 billion euro for the recapitalization of Spanish banks. The ESM, European Stability Mechanism, when ratified next month, stands ready to provide 500 billion euro in fresh money, which comes in addition to the existing 192 billion euro in EFSF commitments for Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. Also, the ECB has intervened on the secondary bond market, purchasing bonds for 220 billion euro. 2 weeks ago, the European Central Bank made it clear that it will not accept higher sovereign bond yields attributable to fears of the breakup of the euro. The euro is irreversible, Mario Draghi said. The ECB decided it may undertake outright open market operations of a size adequate to reach this objective. However, in the future, any intervention from the ECB to support a particular member state will be conditional on the involvement of EFSF or ESM and thus subject to strict conditionality. The ECB and EFSF, ESM are ready to act in concert if member states request financial assistance, thus ensuring credibility while alleviating market concerns about the size of the firewalls. The success of the EFSF as an issuer is of fundamental importance for borrowing countries, which benefit directly from the low interest rates the EFSF is paying in markets. Our cost of funding, below 2.5% for 10-year bonds, and at negative rates recently for 3 and 6 months bills, is directly passed on to borrowing member states and delivers substantial budgetary savings for them. Now, have all problems been solved? The answer is no, but Europe is moving in the right direction. Europe has committed to do whatever is necessary to safeguard the euro and financial stability of the euro area. What is then the vision of the future Europe and how can we get there? Discussions are underway to advance with 4 unions: banking union, fiscal union, economic union, and in parallel, political union. The first of the 4 unions, banking union, stands on 3 building blocks: a single European banking supervisor, a common EU deposit guarantee scheme, and a bank resolution framework. The banking union should include all euro area members, but it may be open for other EU member states who wish to join later. During the euro area summit in late June, there was a clear decision as a first step to proceed swiftly with the establishment of a single European supervisor. The ECB will have a leading function in this regard and ultimate responsibility at the European level. National supervisors who possess the knowledge of financial institutions and local circumstances will be involved in the implementation of pan-European supervision. One could envision the ESM taking the lead in implementing another building block, operating a common deposit guarantee fund and resolution framework. This has not been decided, but once a single European supervisor is established, and if the ESM is mandated to participate in bank recapitalizations directly, these tasks would create complementarity and synergy. Second, several proposals are under consideration to move towards stronger fiscal union. If the improved fiscal coordination rules which are described are fully implemented, the euro area will already function much better. However, markets have become so skeptical about the design of the euro area that a qualitative jump towards fiscal and economic union may be needed. Hence, while many important steps towards better fiscal governance of the euro area have already been taken, the pooling of decision-making and ultimately pooling of risks could be pursued further. Third, stronger economic union assumes advanced economic policy coordination and further integration of markets. We have seen the consequences of insufficient policy coordination, which resulted in significant macroeconomic imbalances and misallocation of investment. And finally, as we learned during this crisis, we need a stronger political union in Europe. A stronger union rests on stronger legitimacy, stronger democratic foundations, and a clear roadmap indicating how we will get there. To make sure that European citizens have a greater say in electing the leadership and the elected have a clear accountability. The role of the European Parliament, in cooperation with national parliaments, will become ever more important. Proposals are also on the table to elect directly by the entire population a president with an enhanced executive role, combining the roles of today's Commission President and the EU President. The role of the European Commission as an executive body could also be strengthened further. But one has to be realistic about the timeline for these proposals. It could take up to a decade to implement these ideas into reality, as changes in the EU treaty and in national constitutions are required. But Europe is determined to begin that process now, and the European Summit will examine proposals to that effect at their meetings in October and December. Let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen. A strong and stable euro area is in the interest of Europe and, I believe, also in the interest of the world economy at large. Since the beginning of European integration more than 60 years ago, the ultimate goal of the European project has always been to bring prosperity and stability across Europe while being a reliable partner for the world. Great efforts have been made at the national and the European level to overcome the current crisis. Institutional gaps in the initial design of EMU are being closed. I'm confident that a year from now, you will be hearing more good news from Europe, as hard data will show progress in overcoming macroeconomic imbalances, and additional decisions on our move towards a banking, fiscal, economic, and political union are adopted. In responding to the crisis, Europe is taking historic steps. This will ultimately benefit its citizens and the world at large. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your excellent address, Mr. Regling. You've argued strongly, and I think convincingly, that there are now some clearly identifiable signs that Europe's collective response, particularly through the EFSF to the crisis in the Eurozone, is already bearing fruit. But you've also made a convincing case, I think, that closer banking, fiscal, economic, and not least political union are going to become facts of life over the coming years. We now have slightly more than 20 minutes for questions and answers to provide an opportunity to discuss your arguments, and I would welcome questions from the floor. I would ask if you could please, if you wish to ask a question, please give your name, your affiliation, and also if you could keep your question as brief as possible. And please do stay in your seat and the microphone will come to you. So I now invite the first question from the floor. Sir, on the left here.
Thank you very much for your lecture. My name is Yoshioka from NHK, Japan's public TV station. I'd like to ask two questions. First, in order to make EFSF more stable, what kind of support would you like to have from Asian countries? And in order to do that, my second point is, what kind of actions do you believe are needed for European countries to do more? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. In general, I feel that I get a lot of support from Asian countries in the form of buying the bonds and bills that are issued by the EFSF. And that's really the support I can expect. On average, Asian investors have taken almost 40%, 40, of the bonds issued by the EFSF during the last 18 months. That's a relatively large share. And this comes from all type of investors, governments, central banks, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, all investors that need to invest. Of course, they do not invest because they like the euro or they like me. They invest because they find a product that hopefully is commercially interesting for them, where the risk-reward balance is appropriate. That's what we try to achieve. And I think we have been successful in that respect. Going forward and to maintain the support, of course, requires that we make good progress in the euro area. That's what I have been talking about, progress at the national level, where the imbalances have to be reduced on the budgetary side, competitiveness. That is happening, I talked about that, and where we make progress at the European level with a better governance structure, where the policy coordination is tightened, and therefore the problems that we have seen the last few years are eliminated and do not reappear. I think that's the best we can do for the world economy. And as I tried to say, we are in a good way. And therefore, I hope that Asian investors will continue to buy our products.
At the back. Madam, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Christine Che from JP Morgan. My question is, if the German Constitutional Court ruled that EFSF and ESM to be unconstitutional in September 12 voting, then how will EFSF and ESM role change and how will your agenda be taken forward? Thanks.
This is very unlikely to happen. Of course, courts are independent, and certainly the German Constitutional Court is very independent. They will rule on the 12th of September, that's right. The German parliament ratified already the ESM treaty with a more than 80% majority. But a few members of parliament didn't like that and took that to the Constitutional Court. So most observers do not expect the scenario you described. I'm not arguing the probability is zero, but I argue it's very, very small. In this very unlikely event, the EFSF is there and could continue to work and could do even more work. But again, I don't expect this to happen.
Sir.
Don Hanna from Fortress Investment Group. Thank you, Klaus, for the very cogent presentation of the roadmap going forward. I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on one conflict, at least the market sees, which is, you mentioned in terms of political union, the need for a greater basis of democracy across Europe. But one of the outcomes of this process over the last 2 years is, in some sense, greater animosity across borders. There's still a discussion, even in the case of your own appointment, of you as a German as opposed to a Frenchman or a Spaniard, and those sorts of tensions and nationalism that has been, in some sense, exacerbated by these issues. There's as well the conflict or dissonance between this very strong unity among European elites about the need to continue this 40-year project of the euro and of continued integration on the fronts you mentioned. But opposition often in different locations in Northern Europe or Southern Europe to that very process, which acts as some constraint. How do you see those areas of dissonance evolving going forward? Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. No, you're right on. There are tensions, more tensions than before the crisis across borders and between the North and the South. But there's still a very large majority in favor of European integration in all member states, and also still a majority in favor of the euro. I would expect that after the crisis, these tensions will become less. But the idea to also move more towards a political union, where the citizens have a stronger say and they see a more direct representation of their interests at the top level, for instance, by electing a president, a European president, directly, that this will help to create more identification with the European project again. But there's a problem right now, I admit that, and we have to be aware and we have to find ways to deal with that. But being in the middle of the crisis, maybe it's not so surprising that this is happening at the moment. And I remain convinced that we will move out of this crisis in the foreseeable future. I described the progress that we see. I think more than half of the adjustment has been done. It takes a while before markets fully accept this. They do accept it, for instance, in Ireland. Ireland started its adjustment process in January last year, so about 17 months ago, 18 months ago. And 2 weeks ago, they were able to go back to the market and have their first 5-year bond issue again, quite successfully. So it took about a year and a half of very tough adjustment, very hard for the population. And then markets also believe that this is really for good. And this is very similar to the experience we have with IMF programs over the last 50 years, where also initially markets don't believe that governments will really change course, will improve their policies, do all the painful reforms, and that these reforms will show results. If markets immediately believed it, one could close down the IMF and we wouldn't need the EFSF. So markets are reluctant. They want to see hard facts. That's why we have the IMF at the global level. That's why we have the EFSF and in the future the ESM to provide the financing in the interim. It took 18 months in the case of Ireland. The other countries like Portugal started half a year later. Greece is a very special case. So I think we are on a good way, and the tensions that you describe are there, but they will also be overcome.
Thank you. Sir.
Iftikhar Chaudhry, Institute of South Asian Studies. Thank you very much, Mr. Regling, for your very insightful expose. My question is, there are two tendencies that are apparent in Europe. One is, of course, the horizontal state integration that you described. On the other hand, there is also what the Germans call the Weltinnenpolitik, some kind of community politics within nation states. Are these two elements in contradiction, and how do you hope to reconcile this?
What do you mean by?
Weltinnenpolitik is community politics within a state, for instance, with the NGOs, non-state actors, etc. So, whereas the European Union focuses on more governmental unions, you have a burgeoning importance of actors who are not necessarily governmental. And do these create a counter pressure on these ideas?
Well, I think we see worldwide indeed a trend towards more action at the non-governmental level. Yeah. And it links a little bit to the previous question maybe. We have to create a European identity, a European dialogue on all these issues. That would also mean that NGOs and other non-governmental entities work more closely together across European borders. I think that's what is lacking so far. And as we move towards the political union, the hope is that that will also be resolved and will help to bring the citizens closer to the European project.
Just in the middle there. Thank you.
Anthony Wilkinson from Deutsche Asset Management. Thank you very much indeed for your lecture. I thought it was fascinating. My question relates to Greece, because given your positive assessment that Europe is moving in the right direction, can we therefore conclude that a Greek exit is, not on the cards at all under any circumstances?
No, that would be too simple. First point is that Greece is a really unique case in the euro area for several reasons. The Greek economic situation is more difficult than that of any other euro area member state when you look at fiscal deficit, debt levels, lack of reforms. All this is really quite different. And as you remember, they also have not been telling us the full truth about their economic data from the moment they joined EMU. Also, the political system is much stronger in the other countries, whether it's Spain, Portugal, Ireland. They all had changes in government during the last 18 months where new governments came in with a large majority, but with a mandate, importantly, to implement the reforms that are necessary, to implement the adjustment. And the opposition in these countries is cooperating. All this is not so clear in Greece, so it is really in a more complicated situation. To simplify it, one can say that Greece is really a question of solvency problems, while the other countries have liquidity problems. And that's also why in the case of Greece, and this is the only case where we need this, private creditors were asked to accept haircuts, and they provided debt reduction amounting to more than 100 billion euro last year, which was equivalent to 50% of Greek GDP. So a substantial reduction in the Greek debt burden. This will not be needed in any other country. So now, in the policy world in Europe, nobody wants Greece to leave the euro area. It would be the most expensive solution for Greece and for other member states. It's not a policy objective that Greece should leave. So, and I also don't want to see Greece leave. But it's also true that it depends on Greek action. They must implement the structural and fiscal adjustment measures that they committed to undertake in exchange for receiving financial assistance. If the Greek government implements the program, they will continue to receive financial assistance, but they have to deliver. Otherwise, financial assistance could stop, not because we wanted to stop, but it's two sides of the bargain have been in place. That's where we are. You probably saw that there's a lot of activity in Europe this week with the Greek Prime Minister visiting capitals, talking to the key policymakers. And we will see very soon whether the Greek government is able to implement what they had committed to do, and everything will follow from that.
Sir.
Raymond Kwok from Oxford Economics and VC.com. Mr. Regling, following up from the last questions, fundamentally, if Greece is able to show data which is wrong, can you share with us, going forward, how to ensure that data is being provided to any member state in the EU is kosher? Sorry if I use that word. The second one is related to that is, well, in your experience, what do you think it would take in terms of years for this situation to be resolved by itself? Give it a guess. We might miss a decade or two.
On your first question, among the many actions that have been taken in Europe, I could not mention everything, and one is related to your question. Eurostat, which is the statistical agency of the European Union, did not have the power before the crisis to check numbers in member states. They were basically collecting data that were reported to them from the different member states. They harmonized it, added it all up and published, but they could not audit the books. It was tried several times by the European Commission to give them more power, but the member states rejected that. With the crisis, it became very clear that this was really necessary, and therefore it was decided quickly then to give Eurostat the power to check whatever number they want to check. And this is now in place, it's happening. That was also the reason why the Greek fiscal deficit was revised up in several steps. Whenever Eurostat went there, they found something new they didn't know before. This is in place, and Of course, there's never a guarantee against fraud, but what we saw in the past, that for long periods of time, wrong data were reported, this is no longer possible with this important change. So it's one of the many things, one of the many measures that have been adopted to make sure that monetary union will function better in the future. On your second question, of course, forecasts are always difficult and risky. But when I look at the data that I talked about, the adjustment at the national level, I think it's very clear that at least, and probably more than half of the adjustment at the national level in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Ireland has happened. More than half. That means two things. One, there's really progress. But second, it must continue. If it continues at the speed that we have seen, this should be done and should be over within the next 2 years. And I think it will also become more obvious to the markets that this adjustment is really there, because many are not aware. The media don't write about it. The broad public is not aware. So this adjustment is really taking place, and more than half is done. Now, we have to deal with the broad skepticism in financial markets about the design of monetary union. It's more difficult to predict how quickly that will happen. And we have to deal with the financial market renationalization that we see at the moment, because there is this progress at the national level, everywhere on the budget side, competitiveness, but on the banking side, financial markets, we see a renationalization of banking activity. This has negative consequences also for the real economy. This must be addressed, and that is the reason why the summit took the first decision in late June to move towards a banking union by saying that banking supervision should be centralized and taken by the ECB. So this was exactly the appropriate step by the summit, focused now on banking union because the other things are really pretty much under control. So putting it all together, I think it will be clear in a year or two that there's a lot of progress at the national level, but there are still a few other things that also need to be dealt with.
We have time for 2 more questions. Gentleman on the left.
Thanks. My name is Gaurav and I come from the Wall Street Journal, Dow Jones Newswires. Just a question, what's your comment to a proposal that's floating in the Europe that EFSF buy Spanish bonds when they're auctioned and ECB helps to stabilize the market? This obviously in response to your, as a follow-up to your comment that you're ready to work with the ECB. And if there's a proposal to buy bonds from Spain, can you give us a sense of the size of the bonds that you might buy?
Yeah. You're right. When Mario Draghi, the president of the ECB, spoke at his last press conference 3 weeks ago, he talked about this as a possible future model, and I touched upon that in my presentation, where EFSF, ESM on the one hand and the ECB on the other hand would work in parallel in the future, where the EFSF, ESM would or could provide financing through an adjustment program or precautionary program that allows to intervene in the primary bond market. And then the ECB could use that framework to also intervene in the secondary bond market. So this is an idea that has not been discussed yet by the Eurogroup, but it's a possible model that has 2 advantages. One, conditionality would be ensured because EFSF and ESM can only intervene in the primary bond market when there is an agreement with a country, an MOU, where the conditionality is spelled out. And that is what was missing when the ECB intervened in the secondary bond market in the past. So the ECB would have the assurance that they only act when conditionality is there, which really means the country will do the necessary reforms. And the second advantage is that markets concerns that the firewalls, EFSF, ESM don't have enough firepower, that would be alleviated because the ECB would bring its own money. This is a model. It's not agreed yet. Ministers will discuss it next month. And importantly, a country has to make a request for it. which we have not seen so far. If that all comes into place, then this could happen, but at the moment it's only a proposal.
Thank you very much. And one final question, lady just here in the middle.
Good afternoon. My name is Julia Müller. I'm representing the German Friedrich Ebert Foundation. I would like to make a reference to what you said in the beginning of your speech. You said, I want to point out some issues that are in contrast with the mainstream. A few days ago, there was an article in the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung, and the journalist also started by pointing out, I say it in German first, wir quatschen den Euro tot. We're talking so long about the problems of the euro until it's dead. I would like to ask you for your assessment on the kind of psychological effects about talking problems. And as you also made reference to what Mario Draghi said, that the euro is irreversible, and then just shortly afterwards the markets reacted positively on that. Could you please elaborate a bit on all these psychological, media, political, speech effects on the crisis and its adjustment? Thank you.
Yes, there's a problem. And normally I complain about the Anglo-Saxon press in particular, but because we have somebody from the Wall Street Journal here, I will not do that today. But I could complain about the media everywhere, also in Germany. They do not report the facts very well. We know media love to present negative news. So the trends I have been talking about the real adjustment, reducing macroeconomic imbalances, you don't find much about that in the media. And that has a bad impact on many different groups. When I look at Germany, our country, most our fellow countrymen believe that the adjustment strategy that has been adopted, the reform strategy, is not working because they are not told that the results are moving in the right direction, that the results are there. So how should they react if they are not aware that there is actually progress? They don't want to spend more money. So there's a lack of information here. The media are often not particularly helpful. And markets are also skeptical. They don't fully appreciate the progress that is there. Also, we have to acknowledge that Europe is complicated. Monetary union is a complicated animal. We know that. It's not easy when 17 democracies try to work together. It takes more time than markets like. Decision-making takes time. Markets react instantaneously. So there are always these conflicts. But nevertheless, Mario Draghi is right. The euro is irreversible. And looking at the track record, policymakers in Europe have always taken decisions in the end. Markets may complain that it happens too late, but in the end it happens. And I'm sure that the progress that I have been describing will become better known over time. It will continue anyway. The adjustment is really taking place. It cannot be hidden much longer, I think. And then markets will also wake up and see that opportunities in Europe are better than they think at the moment.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to say that I must now bring this fifth IISS Fullerton Lecture to a close. Before doing that, though, I would like to thank Klaus Regling for taking the time to visit Singapore, to present his truly excellent lecture today, and for responding so frankly and comprehensively to those very probing questions that we've just heard from the audience. Mr. Regling, I'd like to highlight your argument that the prosperity and stability of argument is important, not just for Europe, but for the rest of the world. You made strongly optimistic arguments regarding the effectiveness of the measures being taken to restore Europe's economic vitality, and also regarding the wider prospects for Europe's closer union in four spheres: banking, fiscal, economic, and political. In your words, Europe is taking historical steps. these arguments, I think, constitute a valuable corrective to the more pessimistic views that we sometimes hear regarding Europe's present dilemmas and its future. So thank you again for speaking here this morning so eloquently. Thank you very much.